important to talk about the internet and its import. The internet brings information to people who are susceptible, if you will, to manipulation, and we all are to some degree susceptible to manipulation. And I think as humans we are. But if you understand media better, it will help you not be so tremendously overwhelmed when trying to digest what is coming at you. The internet's terrifically important. I mean, what we're doing right now is political. What we're doing right now is politics. I don't think you can take politics away from people. I think every interaction you're engaged with is political. Every relationship you have is political. If you accept the notion that all, and I do, this is where I'm coming from, all relationships are based on power. And what is power? Some of you had an opportunity to read Robert Dahl's essay on power, and I think it's tremendously important. But politics we can define the way Harold Lasswell does by saying that politics is who gets what, when, and how. Who gets what, when, and how. I think that is a sufficient definition of politics. And since I believe that all relationships are power based, I mean, you want a new car, your parents have hinted to you that they're going to buy you a new car when you graduate from college. That simple sentence illustrates the power of parents, the political power of parents in your life. What does that car represent? Well, it represents freedom and probably small d democracy. It makes you mobile. It may make you appear a particular way if you identify with a brand of automobile. Uh, we in my family are Chevy people, and the other part of the family are Ford people. And so that is a running argument. And then there's all the other ones all lumped together. But we're Chevy people. My dad worked at GM, but my mother's brother is a Ford person, and so people identify with products because, and politicians, because they're really products too, particularly the way that they're marketed to us. And if you know that, and you can come to terms with that, you will be less susceptible to the manipulation of your mind by people engaged in public affairs. And public affairs is really what all of this is about. And what I want to talk to you particularly about today is the notion of what we call, and this is not a judgment of this word. Please kind of wrap your judgment up and set it in a pretty box aside for a while, and let's be frank and blatant, if you will, about public relations, also known as propaganda. All governments engage in propaganda, and all governments propagandize against the other. Part of that is tribalism and the identification with a tribe of people. I mean, we even normalize that by saying, well, my tribe, I'm with my tribe. That means you found your friends, or you found where you're comfortable, or you identify with the same kind of politics and values and marketing strategy that passes for modern day public commerce. where do we get this idea about propaganda, and how is it woven in to the fabric of the society? Well, a fellow named Edward Bernays, and let's see if I can share the screen with you so we can talk about this book. Edward, I'm sorry, I'm not a very good speller. Edward Bernays. And what is propaganda? You can look at his Wikipedia entry here for him, and I want to show you some of the imagery that you're not going to see. Oh, no results. I wonder why that is. Oh, there's a PDF associated with Wikipedia. Let's see if we can find it without. That's interesting. If I get out of DuckDuck and just go straight to, oh, what if I took the word propaganda? I don't know why there are no images. That's interesting. But here's look at it this way. Here we go. This is what the book looks like. And it's still in print. It's been updated by a fellow named Mark Crispin Miller, and he's a really smart guy. And you can download this book for free from many sites. The copyright on it is open now. It's that old. This is, I think, the original cover. Oh, y'all can't see. I'm sorry. Let me share. Sharing is fun. Let's see if we can share the screen, if they'll allow this sort of thing. How about this way? It's odd to me that it's so difficult to share this stuff. It's trying to connect. I think it's a little confusing. Allow, yeah, I want them to see it all. Let's see. Is this it? Allow. It says I'm not in the meeting yet. Here I am. Y'all can see me, right? So I don't know. This stuff is really odd. Every day it's different. I have a complaint into them. It's a bit, yeah, the video's off. I'm sorry. Anyway, let's see. It won't, I don't want you to see that. Let's see. What about application? Will that work? The app? We'll move forward. At any rate, let me tell you about the book. Edward Bernays, and he was, interestingly enough, connected to Freud. I disappeared. Why did I disappear? Y'all bear with me, okay? I tell you, that share thing is just not working out. Oh, it's so frustrating. Did I drop out of the meeting some way? That's me.
You're muted, by the way.
Professor, I think you're on mute. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties. Every time I turn on WebEx, it's like a new adventure. Something's changed, something's different. It's very frustrating. But I was telling you about propaganda. Now, can you hear me still? Can somebody unmute?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
Okay, grand. That's wonderful. Let me talk to you about Edward Bernays. He wrote this book called Propaganda in 1928, and I want you to realize something very important about that time period globally. 10 years before was the Russian Revolution. In 1928, you're coming up very close to the rise of fascism and Hitler in 1933. And so the use of media then, motion pictures, radio, there wasn't television yet. It's in the laboratory, but it will catch up radically. Bernays is related by marriage to Sigmund Freud. And so you can imagine that Bernays had a profound
You
sound.
said Sigmund Freud, Professor?
I'm sorry?
You said Sigmund Freud?
Yes, Sigmund
Oh,
Freud.
that's cool.
Yeah, fascinating,
Okay.
right? And
Yeah,
this
I'm a psychology major, so
good. Okay. Well,
yeah.
this book is really important for psychology. Okay. But it's the neat thing about social sciences is we steal from each other. You know, some days the psychology people are talking about politics. And so on some days the political science people are talking about psychology. It's all interwoven. That's what's so cool about this major. You know, when I was in graduate school, I took a lot of hours in anthropology. And what I really wanted to do was be a political anthropologist, but I really couldn't get people to see that that was possible. But it is, and the field has just exploded. And I sort of should have been there on the wave of it, but other things happened for me, and so I didn't really get to do that. But it colors my perception of politics. So it was good training, you know, to be able to sort of, like an anthropologist, step back and not be emotionally involved. And that's what I want y'all to try to do about some of this stuff going on in public affairs, because goodness gracious, it's overwhelming. I mean, are y'all having some struggle with, my heavens, we're still sort of isolated because of COVID, right? And I mean, these online classes were really a response to COVID. And some people who, you know, I have some technical problems, but you know, I don't mind talking on camera because I worked in television, and I like radio a lot. And this isn't much different than working in radio. I was a news producer in radio. So we draw all, one thing about psychology, correct me if I'm wrong about this. I believe in transactional behavior with people. In other words, you bring all of your experience to this moment. So, like being a psychology major, you're bringing that to this moment, and that's just great. So, we need to recognize that people around us bring all of their experiences to a focal point, to a moment where we interact with them. And so there are things going on. Think about it as applications running in the background that you're unaware of, that you don't know, but and they may not know, but it colors their perception of how they see us, how they see the world around them. I myself, I'm really enjoying experiencing these things with you. I'm curious about how COVID, and many of you have had it, impacted you, your family, your sense of community, your sense of politics, because so much has been in reaction to the previous administration's difficulty in responding to COVID. And that alone was an obsession within that White House to how do we mitigate that we messed around and didn't do anything. And why did we mess around and not do anything? Because we were obsessed with getting reelected. I will say for you that all administrations are that way to some degree. They do have people inside the administration who carry that burden and worry about that so that business can be conducted. But when you're sort of a one-man show and you're doing this for the first time, you've never run an administration, and it's very, very different to do that than any experience, unless you've been a governor. And being a governor is incredibly helpful to being a president. It's very similar. Governors have been, states are laboratories of democracy, and governors, if they have the constitutional power, like California or like New York, where they're actually running the day-to-day operations of the state rather than bleeding something at people, hiding most of the time, but then sticking your head out and saying something and going back because you're not really running anything. It's like the governor of Texas. That's the weakest constitutional office in the country. It's what you make of it, as Mark White, Governor Mark White, who was a friend, told me, that you can make that position more important than the Constitution in Texas thought about it if you have a sense of what public relations and propaganda. So back directly to this book. In this book, and he wrote another book called Crystallizing Public Opinion, which is really important. He wrote that in 1923. He also wrote a book called A Public Relations Council in 1927, which my husband was what we call in slack or slang the flack. He was the press spokesman and pretty much, well, the image maker of a district attorney in McLennan County that he worked for at the time that I met him. My husband was an amazing campaign manager. And if the campaign never stops, that campaign manager is responsible for the development of the message and conveying that message to the public and to other agencies. And so while you rarely saw him unless he was on camera discussing an event, you don't really realize the stagecraft, the public relations aspect of how an office represents itself to the public. In other words, what made, say, President Kennedy's administration different from President Eisenhower's administration or Lyndon Johnson's administration? And I hope you got to look at CNN's special program about Johnson, because he's really informative to the study of government. In this book, Bernays talked about manipulating the masses, that's you and me, and the ability to use symbolic action and propaganda to influence politics. It's what my husband did when I first met him. He used, and Bernays is advocating using the effect, or rather what he's attempting to do is to affect social change and to lobby for things like gender and racial equality, which is what we have been trying to do since the inception of this country. And we rediscover our governing documents like the Constitution, like our aspirational document, the Declaration of Independence. And please don't think that the Declaration is a legally operative document. It's not. What it is a public manifesto, a public statement by one man who was crystallizing the ideas of the country. Probably, in the top 10 most important pieces of propaganda that you could read is the Declaration of Independence. It expresses tremendously important ideas and values of the Enlightenment and of America. And the United States was uniquely positioned at that moment to exercise, and this is before Jefferson or anyone articulated this matter. You have to understand, Jefferson is the first person to stand up in a governmental way and say, King George, you cannot be my king anymore. And these people are with me about that. It had never happened before. It had never happened before. Unless, I'm going to say something radical here. Are you ready? Okay. Grab hold of the desk there. We're going to be radical. If you look at the person of Jesus, he is a political figure, if you're like me and think all relationships are based in power. He is a political figure who is essentially standing up to Rome and saying, guys, wait a minute, you're complicating everything with all these little different gods. He is advocating for monotheism, one God, and he has, there were all these rules that the Jews had, and Jesus is saying, look, you don't need any rules. You need two ideas. And those two ideas are that everyone is equal and you are supposed to love each other. That's radical, y'all, because he's saying everybody's equal. If everybody's equal, there shouldn't be slavery. How can you have slave and master if you are equal? You see what a threat that is to the public order at the time? Pontius Pilate saw the threat. And what is Jefferson saying? Jefferson is saying, King, you're no different than me. I don't choose you anymore. Your legitimacy does not come from a divine right of kings. You're king because I accept that you're a king. You can't be king unless I accept you, and I don't accept you anymore. That's all it's saying. It's saying that the Americas, America, the United States, these United States, as Jefferson says, and by the way, the U wasn't capitalized, states was, these United States, Jefferson is saying, these folks agree with me and we're going to choose our own path. That document continues to inspire people all over the world. Look at Ukraine right now. Ukraine is saying we choose our own path. If they invite us to join NATO, then we're going to join NATO because we're an independent country, and an attack on a NATO country in a collective security agreement is an attack on all countries. Okay? And look at their spokesperson, Zelensky. He understands this book, propaganda, and he is using the basic tenets of it to promote a Ukraine that what? Goes its own way. And this is radical to Russia, who says, no, 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 you're part of us. Kiev, y'all, was the center of Russia. Commerce, ideas, art, literature. Kiev is where it's at. Moscow is secondary if somebody is deeply aware of Russian history. And so that's why when a journalist says this is a war, they get 15 years in prison in Russia. Why? Because if Ukraine is part of Russia, this isn't a war. What Putin has defined it as, he's trying to denazify Ukraine. A lot of Jews live in Ukraine. Zelensky is not a Nazi. By the way, the use of that concept by Putin is straight out of this book, Propaganda. He is trying to scare Russians with that word Nazi. And if those people in Ukraine are Nazis, the Russians have already run them out once, they'll run them out again. The thing is that Ukraine in World War II fought Germany and Russia. The desire to have control of themselves is tremendously important. Jews from Ukraine were the beginning of the Mossad. Y'all know what that is, right? Anybody want to define that for us? In Israel, the Mossad is the secret police, the intelligentsia, the driving force for the security of Israel. They originated from Jews from where? Ukraine. To suggest that people in Ukraine are Nazis is just absurd. He's propagandizing. He's propagandizing. And you have to be aware of that as you get dragged through by our media about this war. And I have to say something at this juncture about this, because all day long it has been a propaganda promotion by media. I'm getting it on at least two channels, okay, two media outlets, CNN and MSNBC. They want, and they're very clear about this, they're not even pretending to be objective about this. They are suggesting to us that the United States needs to give fighting jets, our top of the line, classy, best flying machines for war, for defensive and offensive capabilities. We need to give our jets, our big F fighters, to Zelensky so that they are able to fight the Russian MiGs. And the MiGs and the United States F fighters would be engaged in conflict. And that cannot happen. This cannot become a proxy war between the United States and Russia. Folks are talking about nuclear war, World War III, and nuclear war. And those jets are the first step toward that. So many people in the government who have sense are telling media people, no, we can give them surface to air missiles. We can give them some eye in the sky intelligence. We can help in that regard, but we're not going to give them any planes. President Biden sent Vice President Harris to Poland this morning. And she said, we love you, but you ain't getting our airplanes, because this is not going to be a proxy war. You're crossing a line there. That's the line. And it cannot be. And this horrible incident where Russia bombed a maternity hospital where there were children and women giving birth, they bombed it unapologetically. It wasn't, oops, we didn't mean to. They meant to. And they did it for what reasons? The propaganda ability of it. Russia is saying there were no pregnant women there, there were no children there, but there were insurrectionists, there were these Nazis, and we're rooting them out. And so they show pictures on Russian television that look quite different than what the Americans are showing on television. And this does become a televised iPhone war that's on TikTok and on Pinterest and on Facebook and everywhere else. Excuse me a minute. Cut that out. I have a mama and new kittens in here, and she's teaching them about the litter box while I'm trying to teach you about propaganda, which might be a different form of litter box. When you're looking at this, and you should do some research about this book, it's so interesting. What the book says in chapters 1 and through 6, the complex relationship between human psychology, democracy, and corporations. Bernays' thesis is that invisible, and I got my air quotes there, invisible people who create knowledge and propaganda rule over the masses with a monopoly on the power to shape thoughts, values, and citizen responses. Can I say that for you again? There are these invisible people who create knowledge, propaganda, and they rule over the masses with a monopoly on the power to shape thoughts, to shape values, and citizens' response. What he does and what he talks about is engineered consent of the masses would be vital for the survival of democracy. So Thomas Jefferson, he writes this Declaration of Independence, and what he is trying to do with that is really engineer the consent of the masses so that they can break away from the king. I don't know if you're aware of this. It's probably not talked about much in your history classes, but what's there is that about a third of Americans didn't support the American Revolution. About a third of Americans wanted to remain part of England. And so what they're trying to do, I'm sorry? You think the kitten helps as my visual aid, rather than show y'all the Declaration, the kitty can talk to you about this. What Bernays explains is this. He says the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in a democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government. We called media the fourth estate. They're so important. You understand, the first estate, the second estate, the third, three branches of government: Congress, the presidency, and the courts. But the fourth leader there is media. And what Bernays says is that those who use this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, a fourth estate, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our taste formed, our ideas suggested, and we don't know who actually does these things, who manipulates us, who puts these ideas in our mind. People are moaning about the price of gasoline like it's vital, and they'll complain about a $4 a gallon of gasoline while they're standing there drinking a $6 cup of coffee. It's just fascinating to me that people will really complain about that. By and large, though, they won't understand the issues of supply and demand. I mean, they think the president sets the price of oil. It's just absurd. Yet it's easier to blame Joe Biden for this than to look at the complex economics that really drives that. This manipulation of our mind, this formulation of our taste. And by the way, I'll just give you a quick example of this. In the 1970s, in the music business, disco music was really important, really big. And the record manufacturers went all out with that kind of sound. In the 80s, it was sort of electronic music, and they really invest in that very heavily. So that's why you hear that particular distinguished concept about music. It's because radio, television, you didn't have iTunes then, but we bought CDs. The entertainment industry went all out for that prevailing sound. That's why some people who are independent are not well known, because they don't have this media manipulation machine behind them to bring them to the attention of lots of Americans. I mean, for instance, why is rap music considered sort of outlaw-like music, sort of identified with a certain group? Sometimes those groups are engaged in criminal activity. Why is that? Is that some of the resistance to that music because it identifies strongly with particular groups of people? People don't want their children listening to it. When I was a kid, they gave the Beatles hell. People didn't want you listening to that long-haired music, And then they gave there's always a popular male singer that dominates music. People criticized Frank Sinatra. People criticized Elvis Presley. People criticized the Beatles. That kind of criticism is always fascinating to me. And the story in America is that male singer is going to win over everybody. It's kind of a storyline that these generational male music people depend upon. Bernays expands this argument that our minds are molded and our tastes are formed and our ideas are suggested by people we've never even heard of. He expands this argument to the economic realm, appreciating the positive impact of propaganda in the service of capitalism. Do you know what I'm talking about? Advertising. You know, it's so important, y'all, that McDonald's pull out of Russia. They had a heavy investment there. Those stores were owned by McDonald's. They were not franchises. McDonald's had made a huge investment. And you know, when you see McDonald's, aren't you sort of seeing America? Some products are so closely identified with American culture that it's inseparable. So the moment McDonald's saw that Russia was engaged in this horrific conflict, they left. Coca-Cola. This is democracy in a bottle. Yeah. I mean, look at this. Can y'all see this picture? Can you see this original picture? Okay. It's got a Coke bottle there. It's not there on accident, y'all. Nixon is closely identified with Pepsi, and Pepsi is closely identified with the Republican Party. The owner of Pepsi at the time was, are y'all aware of the actress Joan Crawford? She had married Mr. Pepsi, and he promptly died, and so she was running Pepsi. So that Coke bottle there, though, is closely identified with the spread of capitalism and democracy. I mean, there's even a movie about a Coca-Cola bottling plant opening up in East Berlin, which was dominated by the Soviets. And the movie's called 1, 2, 3. And it's fascinating that Coke would lend its name to this movie, but that exactly shows you Bernays' thesis that there is a positive impact of propaganda in the service of capitalism. And if you have any training in understanding the problems of capitalism, and that's an important part of your education. If you're going to have a well-rounded education, you could paint this conflict along those lines. That Putin's not a communist, for heaven's sakes. No, he's the biggest kind of unfettered capitalist you could imagine. He's a capitalist with no filters. What he does is, he's a gangster, y'all. What he does is he says to these powerful oligarchs, these guys who actually run Russia, if you cut me in for 50% and keep me elected, the law in Russia will never touch you. And so that's why there's pressure in the form of seizing these guys' bank accounts and their yachts and their stock and their interest in capitalism, seizing it, because that money directly fuels Putin. And so we're putting the squeeze on him with money, because Russia is a capitalist society. The thing about Putin, though, is he is an authoritarian. And so you're having capitalism and authoritarianism bump into each other in this conflict. And what Ukraine wants is to be capitalist and be a liberal democracy. And they recognize their import to Russia, but they want to join NATO because they're so different. They're in danger if they stay independent. Putin wants them neutral, and he's running people out of there. I mean, there's 2 million or so refugees pouring over that border, and that's really why we're there. We're there to help NATO countries deal with the chaos that Putin is creating. And we're not going to get involved in a ground war with Russia, because, folks, it wouldn't even last very long before it would be over. And all life on this planet, this small planet, would be over. You know, I've been to Ukraine. I care about these folks, but I am not willing to go to global thermonuclear war over Ukraine. It's like trying to go to global thermonuclear war over Cuba. I was 6 months old when that happened. And if anybody had asked me, I would have said, no way. Okay. My dad had been a communications officer in the U.S. Army when the Berlin conflict broke out. And then again, when we got into this conflict over nuclear weapons in Cuba, he was called back to active duty. And so it had a personal effect on my family. And so this has been a subject that's near and dear to me. Bernays says that a single factory potentially capable of supplying a whole continent with its particular product cannot afford to wait until the public asks for that product. It must remain constant it must maintain constant touch through advertising and propaganda with the vast public in order to assure itself the continuous demand which alone will make its costly plant profitable. And I mean, use Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola is based in Atlanta, Georgia. And you can read the fine print here on the little bottle. The syrup is a secret. The formula for it is a secret. Now, when Pepsi went into Russia, they had to give their formula to the Russians. That was the deal. And they were first. I mean, this was way back. When I was in the Soviet Union, there was no Coca-Cola. There was only Pepsi. And I hate Pepsi. It tastes like the can it came in. It's just awful. All right. And I probably don't groove on the whole Pepsi bod. And they've tried to apologize for being, you know, the man. But, you know, and they've had cool spokespeople. But no, doesn't do it for me. But at any rate, stick Coca-Cola in that statement. Say that Coke has a single factory in Atlanta capable of supplying a whole continent, well, heavens, the whole world, with its particular product. It cannot afford to wait until the public discovers Coke. No, they have to advertise and propagandize to get people to have a continuous demand. Because look, if Coca-Cola does not expand like any capitalist product, its product every year by about 3%, I mean, it's a big deal. It's in movies, for heaven's sakes. In that movie about the future with Sylvester Stallone, they talk about the cola wars, right? And all they've got is fast food, and you know, Pepsi won, and Taco Bell is Pepsi. Anyway, that's what they're laughing about in there, is the incessant advertising, and y'all, a way of life and a way of thinking. What did Coca-Cola tell us? You know, I'd like to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony. You know, little song. Y'all can YouTube that, check that out. That's not just about a product or the taste of that product, or for heaven's sakes, the taste of a politician. This sensory feeling from our eyes, our ears. If we don't like somebody, we say they leave a bad taste in our mouth. Bernays places great importance on the ability of propaganda, the producer of propaganda, as he views himself, to unlock the motives behind an individual's desires. What makes Putin Putin? What makes Biden Biden? The individual's desires, not simply the reason an individual might offer, Putin is never going to tell y'all that he is a resentful white male who the parade passed by. He is the old world. He is the old authoritarian. He wants to be, have y'all seen V is for Vendetta? He wants to be that one unifying spokesperson. He wants to bring back the former Soviet Union's boundaries. He wants his name in history books next to Lenin, Stalin, Putin. And y'all, have y'all noticed the trucks? Have y'all seen the story on the news? There's a Z written like in white shoe polish or paint on military vehicles. My heavens. Okay. So that means that the command knows about this Z and they go for it. It's a symbol. It's a letter Z. Now, by the way, the Cyrillic alphabet does not have a C. I mean, does not have a Z in it. Okay. Russians don't have Z's. It's another symbol that makes that sound. Zelensky. If you saw it in Russian, it's not a Z. Okay. When that Cyrillic name comes out. But the Russians have this dang Z on everything. Y'all, what is that? It's their symbol. But doesn't it remind you of something? It's half of a swastika. You can draw a swastika. The first thing you do is draw that Z. And then you draw the other part of it. So they're driving around with this one symbol on their car. And what is that, y'all? It's about white supremacy. It's about uniformity. It's about when Putin said, we need to protect all Russian-speaking people. That's exactly what Hitler said. He was going in to protect all German-speaking people. I was like, oh my gosh, are we going to get out of this? That guy has nuclear weapons. A friend of mine asked me, how many nuclear weapons do they really have that are operational? And I said, enough. Okay. Bernays suggests that propaganda may become increasingly effective and influential through the discovery of audiences' hidden motives. In other words, what he's saying, and this is so Freudian, what drives us, our desires, may become increasingly effective and influential when they are discovered. So why do people associate democracy with Coke? And what is the inner desire of a person to drink Coca-Cola? What's the motive behind that? If they can discover that, and Coke, by the way, has always been about belonging. That is a huge part of driving that product. Okay. Back when it first started, y'all do know that it had cocaine in it, right? Coke, that's where the name comes from. Right? So it was a little different desire with Coca-Cola then. You know, y'all think about that, and it's kind of a cliche. It's kind of silly. Why in the world do people get, my grandmother was up at 4 o'clock in the morning ironing her sheets, and she had a Camel cigarette in her mouth and a Coca-Cola handy. Well, yeah, okay. So, what am I driving about here? And it's time for us to wrap up. The final 5 chapters of the book Propaganda largely reiterate the concepts voiced earlier in the book, and it provides case studies for how to use propaganda to effectively advance women's rights, education, and social services. Those were not ideas that everyone in America subscribed to. But if we use the book Propaganda we could understand how to advance that concept. Okay? So, does anybody have any questions or comments, worries, concerns about the book Propaganda? Any questions or comments about it? It's kind of a, go ahead, please.
As I was saying, the book Propaganda, I have a question about that. It's
Uh-huh.
about, so it does like mention that what like drives us to our motives, what our motives are, and how based on influence, how uh we learn a few things. So how so they spread to the masses, right?
Right.
And I was asking, I have a question about this, and it said like people buy into this, like are they like how are they motivated by this? Are
Mhm.
they just born from it, or they're just like, heavily like supportive to it?
Well, it's sort of a nurture or nature kind of argument.
Mm,
Are we born with this innate desire? Well, if you want to be straightforward about it, our fundamental function in this world is to survive and propagate, to keep the species going. Life on this small planet is pushed and motivated by the desire to reproduce and to
mm.
keep the society going.
It's
So,
based on a system.
yeah, and so there is this system of that where we ritualize marriage and we think that a man and a woman so that they can have children is the point. My husband and I don't have any children. And a lot of people, you know, jump back about that. Well, why'd you get married if you weren't going to have any children? There are other reasons that you get married. Okay. It's not all about kids, but the species really thinks that it is. Okay. And
Mm.
we make all these rituals and all of these social institutions to promote that. Why was it so important that schools reopen if COVID was still a problem? Because kids spread it. Why? Well, I heard these guys saying, well, it's important for people to go back to school because it's important for people to go back to school. It's important to socialize kids with the rest of the tribe. And so we're driven to have them together because really we're the fundamental part of education. The basis of American education is to get different groups of people to live together and accept each other.
So united as a whole, right?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Because what does that do but produce a stable society?
Mm.
And a stable society shops. They buy stuff.
I
What?
also have,
Yeah, go ahead, dear.
thank you for answering my question, and
Sure.
sorry if it was unprofessional.
Oh, no, 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 no. No, you're terrific. That's fine.
Okay, so I was wondering what I saw the news, and I did see the Z's in the vehicles, and they were using it for transportations and
Well,
like for
that's
civilians. Yeah,
yeah.
I was wondering what that was, and you said like it could be another like meeting. I didn't really thought about that.
It
And
that
what
is that is what those folks identify with. White
what
supremacist groups
they
use that.
did that on purpose?
I'm sorry.
Did they did that on purpose, or was it
Yeah,
like
they did it on
intentional?
purpose. They identify with that.
Oh,
That's their identity. And that
mm,
is a part, it is not the whole part. Because Russia is a very ethnically diverse country.
mm-hmm.
And by the way, some of that really scares people like Putin. He doesn't know how to govern diverse people. He wants an authoritarian government to tell everybody how to behave about
Mm-hmm.
all kinds of things in their lives. If you think that conservatives here are really conservative, there is Russian conservatism is so extreme. Very conforming society. They don't know what to do about gay people. They don't know what to do about women who don't go into traditional roles. Uh, they do very little to. I will say, let me say this: women and men both are highly encouraged to work and to be productive and to produce. And women are not dissuaded from higher education. Most of the doctors, for instance, in Russia are women. But doctors are not celebrated like they are here in our society. They don't make a lot of money. They have to be, they're much more driven by science rather than money. And when you feminize a profession like teaching in this country, medicine in Russia, they tend to have lower pay because
Mm.
the idea is well, you don't need that. Your husband will supplement your income. That's
Mm.
the thinking there. But that white supremacy notion is very much alive in the former Soviet Union.
Really shocking, to be honest.
It is terribly shocking, given the egalitarian rhetoric about the Soviet Union. There's rhetoric, and then there's reality.
Rhetoric meaning like retort.
The propaganda promoted by the
Mhm.
Soviets was an equal, egalitarian, racially cool, friendly to all races. All races could be Marxist, was the thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And so this idea that some people are more equal than others, you know, um, some remember your Animal Farm? Y'all read Animal Farm, right?
Yeah, I read it. I read in like middle school or
Yeah,
high school.
exactly. So you understand where they're coming from, like that.
Mm-hmm.
They'll
Mhm.
preach equality, but really they're very authoritarian. Okay?
And the reality part.
The reality part is it's very hard for government to use propaganda to get conformity on ideas that are from the outside. Notice that Putin has closed media and sending journalists to jail for not using the appropriate word for what's going on there. And he shut down Facebook. He shut down TikTok.
Mm.
He can't control that citizen journalist. He can't run over here and arrest somebody for being on a media platform denouncing him. And this just drives them nuts that there is
Mm.
so much to control. So they start talking about the good old days.
The Soviet Union.
Yeah, that's a mythical time. That's very important for you to know. When people romanticize the past and say we need to get back to the good old days, you know what the good old days in this country was? Oh my gosh, they weren't real good. You know, these are the good days.
Yeah.
This is so much better.
The
all right?
present day.
Yeah, the present day. So, but what is Putin doing? He's talking about bringing back the old Soviet Union. Now, he won't use those words, but he'll talk about the traditional boundaries. Well, heck, y'all, that was 1947. And how did they get those countries? Because the countries that they dominated were territories that Hitler launched his war on Russia from. So, what did Russia want to do but neutralize those governments and make them friendly to Russia? He's following Stalin after World War II.
I can see that.
That's his good old days. And what it is, y'all, is that, and this is important for you to recognize, there's nothing we can overtly do about this. Covertly, we can exercise our observational ability, our ability to observe, and our ability to challenge the rhetoric that's coming from Putin. We're showing we're showing live video that contradicts his message, his propaganda. people in Russia don't know that there's a war in Ukraine. There's story after story of women saying, I called my mother in Russia and I told her that this was going on, and she does not believe me. That is frightening, y'all, when you can tell your parents what's happening in your life and they don't believe you. They believe Russian television. Does this have a familiar ring to it? There were people in this country who were saying, get vaccinated. You've got to do this to save your life. And yet there were media outlets saying, well, bleach is a good way of getting rid of it. And maybe we can use some kind of light source to sanitize. I mean, a television network was saying this nonsense. And so we had people doing everything counter to science. And, that's the Enlightenment there, who the Enlightenment players were telling us we have to look at science to understand the world around us. We're not going to be superstitious about this. My word, superstition about vaccinations. By the way, I saw a headline that these kids, were moving through Ukraine and they're trying to get out, and people are crowded together like that. It's not always the most sanitary conditions. And they saw kids that had had polio. And we all think that polio has been eradicated. Not in a lot of these rural areas, because people don't get vaccinated. And so we're still trying to convince people that vaccines save lives and prevent disease and disorder. Any more questions? I've got to get ready to do this again at 3:30 for the Texas class, because they're in the same place y'all are. They're studying political participation, and so we have to talk about these ideas. Okay? Questions? Comments? Well, the tape will be available, and it'll be on YouTube. Y'all have a safe break. Be careful. Be well, but watch your surroundings, because while you're on spring break, things can happen out there in the world and happen to you. And I would hate for that to occur. So be safe, be careful, and have a good, productive rest and good break. Okay. All right.
Thank you, Professor. Have a great spring break.
You too.